Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories they're breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by Jamie McIntyre, senior writer for Defense and National Security. Jamie, you wrote this week for the Washington Examiner's print magazine about the legacy and life of Colin Powell, a revered military leader, a figure of 3 Republican administrations, somebody who was widely respected across the political spectrum. You covered him early in his time as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What are some of your recollections from that time period?
Well, that's right, Jim. I covered him starting in 1992, 1993. Back then, by the way, the big issue was gays in the military, which Colin Powell was opposed to allowing homosexuals to serve openly in the military. But I had a lot of interaction with him. I interviewed him. I traveled with him. I actually did a documentary about him that aired on CNN. So I had a lot of me time with Colin Powell. And in person, and I'm sure everybody who knows him would tell you this, he's enormously charming and relatable. He doesn't talk like a, he doesn't talk in Pentagonese. He talks like a human being. And I personally could kind of relate to him because I knew his story, having done a documentary about him, about how he had come from a modest background, the son of Jamaican immigrants. He'd gone to City College. He wasn't, a brilliant scholar, which I could relate to, having gone through college and not really making the honor roll until late in my college career. So to me, I felt like he was, his big advantage was not that he had, a towering intellect or was even a brilliant military strategist, but that he was able to use common sense and wisdom in order to, inform his decisions, and the way he included everybody on his staff in the decisions that he made. And that's why I think the people who work for him, they talk about him in revered terms even today.
Now, you say that there's a lot of mythology that has sort of crept around Colin Powell, that there are a lot of myths associated with him. What are some of the things that you're talking about?
Well, I heard a couple of them referred to in interviews this week, and one of them was, and this was just a little a bugaboo of Colin Powell's, his so-called Pal Doctrine, which he didn't call the Pal Doctrine, it became known as the Pal Doctrine, was often described as Powell advocating overwhelming force to achieve a military objective. And he kind of bristled at that because he felt overwhelming implied that it was like more force than you needed. It was overkill. And the term that he used and that he preferred was decisive force. And his doctrine, the Pal Doctrine, which called for making sure you had a clear military objective, the support of the American people, a decisive military force to achieve victory, and then an exit strategy, was very derivative of the Weinberger Doctrine. Caspar Weinberger gave after the Marine bombing in Lebanon in 1982,
I think?
Yeah, in the 1980s.
83?
Yeah, it was 83. Weinberger gave a speech in which he laid out his rules for the U.S. getting involved in military conflict. And Powell told me he was very much taking the Weinberger Doctrine and sort of putting his own spin on it.
Sure. Colin Powell was also, in the mid-90s, 1995, 1996, talked about as a presidential candidate.
Big time, yeah.
And, there was a lot of hope that maybe he would run for the Republican presidential nomination. He certainly polled very well. But one of the common stories was that his wife, Alma, didn't want him to run, was afraid perhaps he'd be assassinated or something like that. Is that also a myth, or is that a true story?
Well, his wife was not in favor of him running for president. But I've heard a lot of people say, that's the story I heard. She didn't want him to run because as a black man, he might be assassinated. But really, the people who are closest to him, one of his top aides, who was a colonel on his staff at the Pentagon and went on to be one of his closest aides, and others who talked to him during that time, said that the real reason was he just didn't have the fire in the belly. He, as a military guy, considered himself a problem solver. He could look at a military campaign and figure out how to approach that. But he didn't have established positions on a wide range of domestic issues. He felt like he'd have to do that. This was in 1995 after his book tour where he was wildly popular.
Right.
And you know, they looked at the time frame, what they would have to do, all the political things they'd have to do, and the things he'd have to develop positions on, and they basically decided he just didn't feel right about it. And in the end, he just didn't think that he was the guy who could solve all those problems. It's kind of a quaint feeling now that you feel like maybe you have to be super qualified to be president, considering pretty much anybody can announce to be president these days.
Right, it's very different than in today's political climate, where that doesn't seem to matter very much at all, or to have any experience might even be a liability.
Exactly.
A lot of accolades poured in after Colin Powell died. You know, first black Secretary of State, first black National Security Advisor, obviously very important in the Gulf War, very important in the Iraq War. Where would you say, as a military leader, as a widely respected military leader, where does he rank?
So, you know, in some ways, you know, once they start building you up as a hero,
right.
You know, the myths can just become overwhelming. And, you know, and of course, Colin Powell has the one big blot on his record, which was he gave the speech before the UN based on flawed intelligence that basically sold the world and a lot of the American public on going to war with Iraq, intelligence that he admitted later was wrong. And so, you know, I think, you know, Colin Powell was the good soldier.
Sure.
He was a good general. He wasn't the perfect general. And his Pal Doctrine, which was kind of all or nothing, like if you can't win the whole thing outright, really sort of left him being the odd man out in a lot of things where presidents like Bill Clinton and George Bush wanted to use military force in a more limited way that didn't fit the Powell Doctrine, and you know, he was dubbed the reluctant warrior, and that was a label that he actually embraced. He said when anybody would say that, he'd say guilty.
Right.
But I come from a long line of reluctant warriors. So, you know, I think he's, you know, certainly he had an inspiring American story. But I think when history goes back on him, they're going to be looking at a lot of the stuff in perspective and saying he was a good guy. As I said, but he wasn't a perfect general.
Very few people are.
Yes.
Thank you, Jamie.
You're welcome.
You can read Jamie's coverage on weekdays and subscribe to his newsletter at dailyondefense.com.